Hi, Trisha Meek here with Moody Theological Seminary. This is for BP 6600, and this is Faithfulness and the God Who Fights for Us from 1 Samuel 17. I am preaching to my family tonight, and I don't write in my Bible, so I printed and I wrote in the margins on the paper because I don't write in my Bible. And the thought of that makes me feel a little icky. So I just wrote in the margins of the page. In the past few months at the weekly Bible study at my home church, we have been reading through the Old Testament, and we have read Judges, Ruth. No, that's the Old Testament. And 1st and 2nd Samuel. I wanted to make sure I had those in order. And when you read through that way, you see a lot of themes and patterns that you can miss when you just read the books independently, or a chapter here or a chapter there. And one of the things that you can see really clearly when you read through all those books in order in a smaller space of time is that God fights for Israel every time, without fail. When they are faithful, he is faithful, and when they're not faithful, they get the promised consequences. But as soon as they turn back to him, they are faithful. And when the whole nation isn't faithful, there are still pockets of faithfulness that are receiving God's blessing. And you see that really clearly in the story of what we commonly call David and Goliath. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just struggle carrying out my Christian walk with that David level of faithfulness. I'm distractible. I am persuadable. Sometimes I choose things that I think will be more fun over other things I should be choosing, and sometimes I just outright make bad decisions. And I think that's a common thing that we all face as Christians, as people in general. We're all very capable of prioritizing, TikTok over Bible reading. And I get it. TikTok is way easier than Bible reading. It just is. But what does our unfaithfulness have to do with David's faithfulness? Well, we got to set the scene first, okay? So way back in Exodus, when God gives the law to Moses, his intent is for the Israelites to be a nation that are led and centered on him, Yahweh. But he knows that they can't do that they're not ever going to be able to achieve that. So he provides rules for how to anoint a king and what that king should and should not do. And in the chapters that precede 1 Samuel 17, a man named Saul has been anointed king, and then he sins just outrageously twice. God gives super clear instructions through the prophet Samuel, and clear instructions I would beg for from God, just a checklist almost. Do this, do this, do this, don't do that, and we're good. And Saul is just nah, not gonna. I'm gonna do this other thing. And so he loses the anointing. God's dude, if you can't follow simple instructions, you're out. Kingship over. But Saul doesn't immediately leave the throne, and what happens is Samuel is sent to the house of Jesse and anoints Jesse's youngest son David in secret. like nobody knows. David, his family, Samuel, that's it. That's what's happened. And so when we come to 1 Samuel 17, Saul has lost his anointing and David has been anointed king. But nobody knows that David has been anointed king. So let's go to the text. We're going to read the first 11 verses and then we're going to have a few thoughts. So 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 11. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soka and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled the camp in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So Saul has gathered the army. Israel didn't have a standing army. He had to send word through the countryside, gather up all the men. They've marched out to these hills and they've got their battle lines drawn. And on the other hill is the Philistines. The Israelites have been fighting the Philistines almost since the Bible started, and they're gonna keep doing it here. But what's really interesting in these first few verses, when you're kind of just getting the lay of the land, is that in verse 10, the Philistine champion says he's going to defy the armies of Israel. He is in defiance of the armies of God. And they're not, and he can kind of say that because they're not acting like the armies of God. In fact, he calls them the servants of Saul. And verse 11 is very clear that Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So it's not just the army, it's not just Saul, it's everybody there is dismayed and terrified. Now Goliath is huge, right? He's between 6 and 9 feet. He's got this giant helmet. He's wearing this armor that weighs just a lot. And he's got a huge javelin, right? Like a weaver's rod. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, but they're huge, okay? This is not something that I want to add to my list of things to do. Laundry, dishes, make dinner, kill Goliath. Not what I'm wanting to do on my average Monday. But the Israelites know that when they rely on God, God fights their battles. They've seen that over and over and over again. Okay? So let's read some more of the text. We're going to start at verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. So Jesse, David's father, was very old, not David. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The three oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to their commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out in its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. Okay, so let's kind of go back to verse 12. So the war's been going on long enough that David is going back and forth from the battlefield to Jesse's home in Bethlehem and taking care of the sheep. And David's the youngest. He gets the extra work. But, also, you get to go out to the battle and get, the news. And when you get back home, everybody's like, "Hey, how was the battle?" So, yeah, it's extra work, but David's probably a little kind of jazzed about this assignment. Yeah, I get to go see what's going on and doing, all the things. But right as we're getting that information, we have verses 12 through the 15 that are David went back and forth, and then we have verses 17 through 20 where he's taking this food to his brothers and bringing things for his brothers' commanders and all of that. The biblical author sneaks in verse 16. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So 40 is a significant number in the Bible. The Israelites wander for 40 years. There's some other things that happen in multiples of 40 or 40 times. And it's associated with a time of testing, a time of punishment, a time of suffering. And it happens when the Israelites are being unfaithful. And so we should, as readers, be 40, something's not quite right here, right? If we hadn't figured out that something was not going well before, we should immediately be triggered now that 40. Okay? So it's been happening for 40 days, twice a day. So 80 times the Israelites have heard this defiance, right? And now David, the secret king, is going to show up and hear this, and everything's about to change, right? So David reaches camp just as Goliath is coming out with his usual defiance, because the Philistines are defying God with this. God goes before the Israelite armies, and the Philistines are not supposed to be in this land, and like just kind of everything about them is like irritating to the Lord. And so, David hears this, and so he starts talking to the men, and he's like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, how long has this been going on? And like, what happens to the guy who can defeat the Philistine? And the Philistine are just, they're just over there like, this is just day 41. Because they have no idea that the real king of Israel has shown up on the scene and everything's about to change. And so just as like David's kind of getting information, his oldest brother, so remember David's the youngest and he's been anointed king. But in ancient Israel, the oldest brother would have received the double portion of the inheritance. And even when Samuel goes to anoint a son of Jesse, his immediate thought is that it's going to be Eliab, the oldest, and it's not. So it's understandable that there's tension here. But Eliab is just like, what are you doing here? Why, like, you need to be gone. You're not here for good reasons. Get out. And David is just kind of like, whatever. And he keeps talking to the men. And because he's talking to all the men, he catches the attention of Saul. And so that's where we're going to pick back up in verse 32. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Okay, so David gets in front of Saul. David is anointed. He knows he's anointed. But the first thing he does is offer up his services as Saul's servant. Verse 32, your servant will go and fight. David is not trying to usurp Saul or Saul's power as king. David is waiting on God's timing. But Saul just finds this laughable. He's like, dude, you are so little and so young. There's no way. But David says that he can do this because the Philistine is going to go down because he has defied the armies of the living God. David's not doing this in his strength. David's faithfulness in Yahweh is what makes him believe that he can do this. David knows that God is faithful, so David is faithful. So then Saul does something that is just so interesting, okay? So he dresses David in his own armor. Saul's armor would have been distinctive. Everybody would have known that that's the armor of the king. So when they see David go out and fight the Philistine, they would have all thought, there goes the king. So if that's what happens, then when they find out that it's not Saul, they're going to lose respect for him. They might even think it's trickery. Why did Saul send David out in his own tunic? Was he trying to trick us? Does he not think we're smart? What's happening? Or they immediately know that it's not Saul, and they see David in Saul's armor take down Goliath, and Saul loses respect, and ultimately, in either case, David usurps Saul's power and authority. But David doesn't do that. Now, this makes a lot of sense, like logically. We know that Saul is described as being tall. He stands like a whole head above the other Israelites. So just physically, because David is smaller, the armor's not going to fit well. And David is a shepherd, and he lives a shepherd's life, and he works with shepherd's tools, so he's probably not used to a sword. So, just logically, it makes sense that David's like, no, I don't want this. But symbolically, David is saying, no, I'm waiting on God. I have faith in his power, his plan, his timing. If he wants me on the throne, I'm going to be on the throne. And I don't need to take Saul's identity by wearing his armor. David is going to face the Philistine challenger because he has faith in God and knows God is faithful to Israel. So he doesn't need Saul's identity. Okay, so let's kind of recap. Okay, the Philistines are defiant. The Israelite army and Saul are being unfaithful. David, the secret king, has shown up on the scene and is operating in faithfulness to God and only faithfulness to God. He's not trying to usurp Saul's power, and he's not flaunting the fact that he's been anointed. He's simply relying on who he knows God to be. So let's pick up in verse 40 and read through the end of the chapter. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistines, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sha'arim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." So David is taking physical weapons into battle, but more importantly, David is armed with his faith. Okay, as he approaches the Philistine, David is cursed by him. And then Goliath says that he is going to give David's flesh to the birds and the wild animals. But in verses 45 to 47, everything David promises that's going to happen is because of God. Because the Lord saves. Because the battle is the Lord. Because the God of the armies of Israel has been defied. David is simply the instrument through which the Lord is acting through. It's because of David's faithfulness that the Lord is able to act in this way. And so Goliath is defeated. And the Israelite armies are able to basically chase the Philistines back home and plunder their camp. And then just as the scene is coming to a close, we see David again not usurping Saul's power. Saul says, "Whose son are you?" And David is just the son of Jesse. Nothing more, nothing less. He's just the son of Jesse. So how does all of this apply to us? Let's go back to, how does David's faithfulness apply to our unfaithfulness? Well, God has always had a plan for Israel, for humanity, for all of it. And it's through God's faithfulness that everything that has happened has been able to happen. So Saul leaves the throne and David comes to it, because David at his very core is faithful to God. And sometimes we allow our ability to be faithful to equate to God's ability to be faithful. And that's just not true, because God has always acted in what the Hebrew call hesed, which can best be explained as covenant faithfulness, especially on the part of the person with more authority, which in our instance is always God. And our English Bibles, they translate it loving kindness, faithfulness, obedience, graciousness. But it's all of those things. And so I'd like to really illustrate it with an example from my own life. So one of the things that I heard throughout my childhood and said to my own children until quite recently was that you get no sympathy when you are hurt while being disobedient, which on its face makes a lot of sense. You don't want to encourage disobedient behavior by being overly sympathetic to someone that has been hurt, when if they had just listened and obeyed in the first place, they wouldn't have gotten hurt. But what if God acted that way? Would we even have the Bible? Because Eve was disobedient and caused the fall of humanity. But God said, no, I'm going to fight for them. I want them. And if God didn't make that decision, there would be no covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with David. There would be no reason to send Jesus, because God would have no desire to underscore that disobedience with hesed. And so we have to build our attitude about God's faithfulness on his demonstration of hesed, which has been constant throughout the Bible. And when we do that, our faithfulness in God can grow and he can fight through us. So when we look at David and David's faithfulness, we also need to look at God and God's faithfulness to David and the Israelites in that moment, and base our understanding of who God is and how faithful he is to us in those demonstrations of covenant faithfulness and hesed. So I hope everyone has a great week and that you are edified by this. Thank you so much for joining me.